Good evening. I'm Harold Holzer, and I have the honor of serving as director of Roosevelt House, and we are thrilled to have you here for what we think will be a special evening as we welcome our guest, Dan Abrams, who, as you know, I'm sure all of you know, provides regular legal analysis to ABC News. He's on the A&E network constantly, including this evening. And he is a historian who has contributed already, well, a couple of great books, but most recently, Lincoln's Last Trial. You wonder why I'm interested in having him here. But he's switched gears and written a book about the man whose home we're in, FDR, called My Fifth Cousin by Blood and My Uncle by Law. In fact, he said it at the very trial that Dan Abrams has written about in this extraordinary book about a very little-known episode in Theodore Roosevelt's life, in the twilight of his life, and that is an extraordinary legal episode, a defense against a charge of libel that was argued here in New York State. So Dan, welcome.
Thank you.
And
great to be here, and always an honor to be interviewed by you, and always intimidating. So
no,
it's a little better that we're not talking about Lincoln, but
right.
Then I would be reversing.
Have no fear. This was all new to me, I promise, and I think it's going to be considered new by everybody who reads it. So to start with the obvious, why this book and why this case?
So in the context of working on the Lincoln book, the Lincoln book, Lincoln's Last Trial, we used this transcript, the only transcript that exists of any case Lincoln has argued, not from 9 months before he got the Republican nomination. And David Fisher, my co-author, had brought me this and said, fascinating transcript out there, only discovered in 1989. No one's written about it. And I said, come on. Lincoln, the only transcript that exists, can't be possible that no one's really written about it. And of course, it was true. It really had become a footnote to history. And so in the context of doing that, we thought to ourselves, well, if there's a Lincoln trial out there that's become a footnote to history, I wonder if there are other really interesting cases out there with a transcript that we could unearth. And lo and behold, we came upon this case from 1915. And in the Lincoln case, there was a 100-page handwritten transcript, but only of witnesses. No opening statements, no arguments outside the presence of the jury. Here we had almost 4,000 pages of a typed transcript of the entirety of the trial. And what makes this so amazing is, at the time, this was a huge story. The media all over the country was covering it. The New York Times often had 12 single-spaced pages of coverage on the case. They were literally transcribing what was happening in court and publishing it in the New York Times. And so for David and I, it was really exciting because as we got into this, we brought ourselves back to those moments and got that feeling of what a big deal it was back then, and yet how incredibly forgotten it is today.
And an obvious difference, of course, is that Abraham Lincoln argued his case on the cusp of the presidency, but Roosevelt argues or defends 3 years after running in a comeback bid, and with his own vision of returning to the White House still burning inside.
And so I would argue the stakes in terms of Lincoln versus Roosevelt were much higher for Roosevelt in this case than for Lincoln. Yes, that trial, and we argued, was important to Lincoln, but for Roosevelt, the essence of his legacy was here, and he was eyeing the possibility of a 1916 or 1920 run for the presidency again. But just as important is Theodore Roosevelt cared enormously about how people viewed him, and that people viewed him as a man of integrity and honesty And this trial questioned that. The attorney on cross-examination was trying to humiliate Roosevelt. He was trying to stain his legacy. He was trying to, I think the word was, put his hide up on the wall. And we believe, and this is David and I's speculation, is that his lawyer for the plaintiff, William Barnes, may have been part of the reason that this lawsuit was brought, that Barnes's attorney may have also encouraged him to bring this lawsuit against Roosevelt.
So tell us about the action. What was it about? And then also tell us about this man, William Barnes, who is the plaintiff, I guess.
So let's take a step back. And they had been allies, fellow Republicans. In 1912, what was becoming a real divide between them comes out into the open. Roosevelt felt that the 1912 Republican nomination was stolen from him, and that he would have had many more votes if individual voters could have had direct votes in every state in the Republican primaries. And instead, that the Republican Party bosses directed this to re-elect Taft.
I think he did lose the New York primary. There was a primary.
Yes, right. Well,
yeah.
and you look today, even their caucuses, right?
Yeah,
I mean, there's
exactly.
not. So it's not that that was such an incredibly novel idea, but Roosevelt was convinced that he'd been robbed, and he may have been right, that this really was party bossism at its worst, and Barnes was the one responsible. Roosevelt in 1914 was supporting a New York gubernatorial candidate, an independent. And in the context of that support, he put out a letter explaining why he was supporting him. And as part of it, he talked about a corrupt alliance between the head of the Republican Party in New York, Barnes, and the head of the Democratic Party. And Barnes sued him, saying, "You called me corrupt. And that's a libel, and that's defamatory." And so the lawsuit came as a result of that. And the reason I bring up the issue of Barnes's lawyer potentially pressuring him to bring this case is you have to wonder. Barnes as well had his eye on a possible political future. He was looking at possibly running for governor of New York. He had to know that the defense in this case was going to be, "You are corrupt. That is what I called you, and you are corrupt." And yet he brought the lawsuit and dealt with the effects of it.
So is it possible he felt to pursue his own political ambitions, he needed a public vindication, and that he thought he could nail TR's hide?
I think in the end he thought if he could be the slayer of Roosevelt, who again was very divisive within the Republican Party. Again, viewed as much more progressive. The Bull Moose Party was in essence a progressive party. That this could make him a star in the party.
So what are the libel laws in 1915? I mean, people get away with a lot more today without being sued for libel. What was the tradition up to 1915 when Barnes feels he has a case?
So keeping in mind that Barnes is a public figure. I mean, he was nationally known. He was the head of the Republican Party. And so in today's law, under New York Times versus Sullivan, you would have to show that there was reckless disregard for the truth, that he knew or suspected that what he was saying wasn't true. And this case would have been dismissed pre-trial under today's law. Back then, all you had to show was that the statement was what they called libel per se, but defamatory. And if you could show that it was defamatory and that it was of and about the particular person, the burden shifted to Roosevelt to have to prove it was true. There was a great moment early in the case where Roosevelt in the letter was a little coy about referring to Barnes. And his lawyers were trying to suggest that, well, they can't prove that this was necessarily about Barnes. This was about the political system. And Ivins, very early in the case, says, "Fine, we'll call Mr. Roosevelt to the stand." Calls Roosevelt to the stand, and he says, "Mr. Roosevelt, did you write this about Mr. Barnes?" "Yes." "Did you seek to distribute it?" "Yes." No further questions. That was it. The minute they overcame that, it's of and about Barnes, He was the one who distributed it. It was defamatory. The burden shifted. And now Roosevelt had to be able to prove it was true.
You know, there's an interesting, like a double DNA story here that we should discuss, put on the table. One is that Barnes's grandfather, as you reminded me before we started, Barnes's grandfather was Thurlow Weed, the Wizard of the Lobby, he was called. He was a man who made William Seward governor when he was a young man, was a supporter of Lincoln's ultimately, distributor of jobs and patronage. People wrote the most unbelievable things about him without being sued for libel. That if you went into a room with Thurlow Weed and you left and you still had your gold watch, you had a very good day. So that's one element of DNA. The other element of DNA is that Dan's father is the most remarkable longtime defender of the First Amendment and freedom of speech and the press, Floyd Abrams. So that's
He's back there.
There he is.
Yeah.
And so I think you come of your interest in this case naturally.
Well, and look, and that was a great resource to have, as you can imagine, because I have to say it was very complicated at times to understand sometimes the libel per se and some of the rulings pre-trial. And so, David and I gave my dad.
So you had an advisor.
We did. We had an advisor who gave us some numerous notes about the book before it was published.
We found another Lincoln connection that you quote Othello, my good name being more important than all riches, and Lincoln did that in one of his cases too. So you either intentionally or inadvertently put that in there.
Yeah.
So the trial, I mean, Barnes was in Albany, right? He was still the publisher of the family paper, the Albany Evening Journal.
Yep.
Why wasn't the trial in Albany?
So the trial was supposed to be in Albany, and eventually it worked. Roosevelt's team sought a change of venue. I mean, think about that. The former president of the United States, one of the most famous people in the world, certainly one of the two most famous people in America at the time, is seeking a change of venue because he doesn't think he can get a fair trial in Albany, New York. That's how powerful Barnes was in Albany. And eventually the appellate court in New York agreed. And the trial was moved from Albany, New York to Syracuse because there was the concern that Theodore Roosevelt couldn't get a fair trial in Albany, New York because Barnes was that powerful.
And were the Syracuse papers politically aligned in those days? I don't know. Was it still the Post and the Standard, or had they combined?
We quote the Standard a lot.
Yeah.
I don't remember if the Post and the Standard
I think they were separate in those days, and one was Democratic still and one Republican.
But I have to say that when it came to this trial, it didn't really cut across party lines. I mean, they were both Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
It just became a question of, did you despise Roosevelt enough that you wanted to see him fail, in essence?
What was the monetary charge in the original case?
So he sued for $50,000, which is just over $1 million in today's money. And people sometimes mistakenly believe Roosevelt was rich. He inherited quite a bit of money that he blew in the 1880s on cattle and ranching in the Dakotas, et cetera. And so he was well off. But one of the reasons Theodore Roosevelt wrote so many books was in part to make money. I mean, it wasn't just because there were all these topics he cared about. He actually needed the money. And so, losing this lawsuit, while certainly, wouldn't have impoverished him, mattered.
And I'm sure they both had the most expensive attorneys known to humankind at the time.
Well, they had two of the best, and that's part of what makes the book so fun, is that you really do have two really good lawyers, and they are sharp, and they are witty, and they are acerbic, and again, you have this, and Ivins for the plaintiff, for Barnes, really wanted to embarrass Roosevelt.
political animus or just doing his best for his client?
I think political, personal, and
Everything.
also, yeah.
And he was a sick man at the time, right?
Well, we believe that he became, that this trial took it out of him. I mean, this was 6 weeks. But think about this from Roosevelt's perspective too. The former president of the United States moves to Syracuse, New York, for 6 weeks to defend himself and lives at a friend's house. Now, his friend had a very nice house, but he is literally upending his life to go to Syracuse. And often there were a couple of weekends where he didn't return home to Sagamore Hill because he was concerned about legal rulings and wanted to stay there to confer with his lawyers. That's how big a deal this trial was to Theodore Roosevelt at the time.
Wasn't there also a Harvard connection that the judge and
And
Teddy
Barnes
and
Roosevelt had all gone to Harvard.
the judge and Roosevelt had been in the same year, I think. I think you say that in the book, or close.
I don't know if it was
Might
the
have
same
known
year.
each
Yeah,
other. And
I don't. But again, it's like with the Lincoln jury when we talked about, they would ask people, "Oh, do you know the defendant?" "Oh, yeah, I know him." Back then, yeah, it wasn't a big deal.
right.
A little different by 1915. One of the biggest differences between these two books is in the Lincoln days in 1859, courtrooms were still a lot looser. There was still lacking the kind of formality. There were rules of evidence there, but by 1915, it's almost like you would see today. They're using precedent. There's formality in the courtroom. There are no spittoons. It's a different time.
The judge was not awed by TR, right? I mean, he was
No.
tough on him. I was surprised that some of the dialogue and some of the transcript material, he was tough. I'm sure that did not sit well with TR.
Well, and look, and I think part of the fascinating thing about this case is that he was treated like any other defendant would be, and I think he enjoyed that. I mean, one of the great moments is during the beginning of the examination of Roosevelt by his own attorney. Ivins is objecting to every question, trying to break the rhythm, trying to prevent Roosevelt from being able to bond with the jury. And once cross-examination starts, Roosevelt instructs his attorney not to object to anything. He says, "I will handle him." Roosevelt did just that. He was ready. Look, did he become frustrated at times? Yes, but not in the way they were counting on. The plaintiffs were really hoping Roosevelt was going to lose his cool and get really angry at Ivins, and as a result, look bad in front of the jury. And he didn't do that.
But there are moments in which Ivins, he's the lawyer for the prosecution, right?
For the plaintiff,
For
yep.
the plaintiff.
Yeah.
So there are moments when he compares his client's coolness to Roosevelt's gestures, and they make fun of Roosevelt over gesticulating.
He actually
right?
asked the judge to stop Roosevelt from gesticulating at one point, because they get in this back and forth about well, what's the objection exactly? And he's like, well, he's overly gesticulated, and Roosevelt became amused by. I mean, anytime Roosevelt could get Ivins upset, I think he became amused and viewed that as a success.
But Ivins is also making fun of him in a way, right?
He was
saying things like, I need to back up so I don't get in the way.
Exactly.
If you've seen films of Theodore Roosevelt, and there are films of him on the campaign trail, he is constantly hammering away with his hands. So maybe it didn't work. Well, we won't get to the verdict, although I'm sure people can guess what it was.
Well, I will say this about the verdict. The most interesting thing for us in reviewing the transcript was seeing what happened with the verdict. Without giving it away, they think there's a verdict, and then there's not. And it's this unbelievable moment, which had been written about nowhere, that we were like, oh my God, did you see? We were both sort of going through the transcript at about the same time, and I forget which one of us. Did you see what happened? This is crazy. This doesn't happen in courtrooms.
But it's in the transcript.
It's in the transcript.
No
There it is, the whole
one
thing.
had seen it.
Yeah.
So How long was TR on the stand? It was not just an afternoon, right?
8 days.
Wow.
8 days on the witness stand, direct and cross-examination, and then a little bit of redirect examination, and then he actually was called back.
Right.
So
I mean, it was said that he needed to be the bride at every wedding, the corpse at every funeral, so he must have liked to be the constant witness.
You know, we were talking about this before. Roosevelt's, a great biographer, Edmund Morris, wrote a chapter about this in Colonel Roosevelt, the third of his trilogy on Roosevelt. And, he kind of poo-pooed it and kind of viewed it as sort of an embarrassing moment in Roosevelt's career. And we viewed it very differently. We viewed it as, for Roosevelt, he's on the front pages again, every day. And he's getting to say the things that he thinks are really important about the political system. And everyone's listening. And so we don't think that this was just look, when you look at it, the question that I'm sometimes asked is, how did this become a footnote to history? And the answer is because there was no sort of groundbreaking moment sort of defining Roosevelt. But I would argue that the reason it's so important is because it's an overview of everything about his legacy that comes up in this trial, where he is forced to defend it. And the idea of getting not a speech, not a book, but actual cross-examination back and forth for days of Theodore Roosevelt is such a unique opportunity to see and hear Roosevelt in his own words.
I think you make a really good point, and I after reading your book, I did go back and read the chapter that Edmund Morris had written. In fact, I had asked Edmund Morris if he would like to be the interlocutor tonight. This was obviously before he passed away suddenly a couple of weeks ago, but he had written a new book of his own, and he wanted me to focus on that. Morris, I think Morris looks at it purely as an historian.
Yes.
Looking back through history, it was humiliating for a former president to be on trial. You're looking at it as a journalist and as an attorney. And I think you're into Roosevelt's personality, into his head more. I think he probably did relish it.
Look, and I can, I will give away the ending because it's somewhat evident that when he ultimately prevailed, and it wasn't expected that he would prevail. His lawyers didn't think he was going to win. He didn't think he was going to win. When he ultimately prevailed, he had a who's who. Remember the who's who in America, where you write your own summary. And he put this trial, this and one other trial he was involved in, had more space in who's who than the Panama Canal and other major achievements for Roosevelt as president. This trial was a big deal to Theodore Roosevelt.
Before we do it chronologically, it's my fault. Roosevelt was no stranger to libel cases. Tell us about the other involvements he had as a protagonist, instead of a defendant.
So this was he was the plaintiff in a case where a paper had accused him of being a drunk. And it wasn't just the paper. There were rumors going around that Roosevelt was a drinker. And he was getting tired of it. And he wanted to wait for the right paper, meaning a paper not of his political party, who made the comment in a way that he would take them to court and make the statement he wanted to make. And the Iron Ore, I think was the name of the paper in Michigan, wrote an article saying that he was a drinker and he was drunk. And he sued them. And he presented all these witnesses who Roosevelt testified he's never been drunk in his life. He had all these witnesses who testified they've only seen him drinking milk. And he said that every once in a while he would drink, quote, light wine, but that he never had any other kind of alcohol, et cetera. And when their case ended, the publisher got up and said, look, I can't defend it. We don't actually have proof. And a verdict was directed, and Roosevelt agreed to take a symbolic 6-cent verdict where he said that would be just enough to buy a good paper. And
But not a bottle
this
of wine,
paper,
right?
yeah.
Right.
But most interestingly, from a sort of big picture perspective, is Roosevelt, of course, had a very much a love-hate relationship with the media. On the one hand, he was the first president to have invite the press into the White House, and to have basically created what has become the White House press room. He had regular conversations with reporters and literally went back and forth with them on issues, and he cared a lot. And then he was also very critical at times. I mean, when he called the reporters muckrakers, he did not mean it as a compliment.
That's a very good point.
He meant it as an insult. He, in 1908, used the Department of Justice to prosecute two media organizations who had written negative articles about him, questioning where certain money had gone with regard to the Panama Canal. And he used the Department of Justice to prosecute them, a case that continued its way through the courts until after Roosevelt had left office. But the point being that, there were some Trumpian aspects to Theodore Roosevelt when it came to the media.
Don't give anyone any ideas about proceeding against the press. But so I'm going to just take issue with one thing you said,
Yes.
because I'm working on a book now about the presidents and the press,
Yes.
from Washington to Trump. I don't think any reporter would ever say that he had a conversation with Theodore Roosevelt. He might have gotten one question in, and then it was like he was off to the races.
Yeah, sure.
And there are great recollections about
Well, I
his-
learned, of course, about Lincoln's purchase of the German newspaper from reading your book,
Right.
Which I had no idea.
That'll be back in the new book.
All
too.
right.
I'm going to recycle that. So one of the moments in this case that I think our audience would be particularly interested in, although the whole thing is fascinating, but one of the witnesses in the trial was a dashing young Democrat named Franklin D. Roosevelt. So tell us about that.
It is kind of amazing when you think about that. So he had just gotten the position that Theodore Roosevelt had held as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He had long been you probably know, a New York Democrat. And he was called to testify not as a character witness, but because he had been in the legislature at the time and had heard about a conversation between about Barnes and the head of the Democratic Party, basically agreeing not to resolve an issue about U.S. senator, about who would become senator of New York, so that the bosses could retain power, trying to avoid getting into the weeds on this fight that they got into. But that was a key question in this case, was the 1911 Senate election, and whether Barnes and the head of the Democratic Party had basically been in cahoots together. And Roosevelt said that he had heard about this, and he confronted Barnes about it. And Barnes didn't really respond, et cetera, and eventually they did reach an agreement on who should be the senator. But Franklin Roosevelt, like Theodore Roosevelt, was a big advocate of the direct election of senators by voters, as opposed to the state legislature, which was the case back then, where the state legislature was effectively electing by vote, but effectively appointing the U.S. senators. And Franklin was a progressive Democrat, the way Roosevelt was a progressive Republican. And so on certain issues, they actually very much agreed. And so Franklin Roosevelt had been advocating within the state Senate to try to get more representation, to get someone who would support direct election of senators, and in the hope of getting a progressive. So he testified briefly, but the vision of Franklin Roosevelt walking into court to defend the distant cousin, but who he had great admiration for, always.
Although he had supported Wilson 3 years earlier, right?
Yeah, but always
Very
admired
very much.
Teddy.
And just think about how amazing it is, aside from just the idea of a striding, healthy
Right.
Roosevelt in 1915, 6 years away from the polio striking him. But 2 Harvard grads, state legislators, assistant secretaries of the Navy, governors, ultimately presidents. remarkable path, common path that these two Roosevelts followed, even though one was from a longtime Democratic family and one from a longtime Republican family.
Yeah, and I think it was that Theodore gave away Eleanor at the wedding.
At which
Yeah.
Franklin's mother took a look at the venue, which was a father and son double townhouse. And she said, that's for me. And this is the result. She built this for her son and her daughter-in-law. And then, as our audience knows, because we talk about it all the time, she made sure that most of the floors had retractable walls or open doors. And she was on both sides of the house 24 hours a day. So did FDR make a difference in the case, do you think?
I think he was definitely a relevant witness in trying to show the very issue at the heart of the case, which is this corrupt alliance between the head of the Democratic Party and the head of the Republican Party. And when Ivins, at the end of the case, is trying to dismiss critical witnesses' testimony, Franklin Roosevelt was one of them, that he was trying to get stricken from the record because he was concerned about the impact that it would have.
So you say in discussing the jury reaction, or what you surmise to be the jury reaction, that it comes down to credibility versus demeanor in some ways. Do you think that maybe TR's demeanor was going a bit out of style? He is sort of a 19th century character with the overabundant gestures, and maybe Barnes is a little more dignified, even though you say he's sort of oily. Who wins the demeanor contest and who wins the credibility contest?
I mean, look, demeanor obviously we're basing it all on newspaper reports from the time, so it's a little tricky to be making an assessment of that. But I think that part of what worked with the jury was Roosevelt's passion for what he was saying. I mean, and keep in mind, they were going after Roosevelt on everything from whether he was eligible to be governor of New York, based on where he lived when he was with the Rough Riders, to whether he paid his taxes properly, to what he expected from campaign donations.
So why were old allegations about residency permissible in evidence?
And I was surprised.
I'm not blaming you.
No. I'm surprised the judge let in a lot of this. But basically, the argument went: you say Barnes is corrupt, and yet you did exactly the same things that you're accusing Barnes of doing.
Kinda, but yeah.
And
I understand.
you
break it down.
You would have been an excellent advocate for the other side, but this was the reasoning, and I'm with you on the fact that it does seem tenuous to me, but the judge allowed it in and allowed this kind of mucking up of Roosevelt to show that he was part of the backdoor dealsmanship, and also that you could make an argument that Roosevelt engaged in corruption, although none of it stuck. It was a great moment when he was challenging Roosevelt about paying his taxes properly. And Roosevelt said, "I don't recall." "You don't recall? I thought you had such a great memory." And he said, "I don't recall." And then Roosevelt, they go to a lunch break, and Roosevelt comes back into court with a stack of his taxes, which they had known this was going to be an issue. He's reviewed them at this point, confirmed that what he said was accurate, and he hands them to Ivins, and he says, "They're here in front of the jury." And they sort of stunned Ivins.
He didn't say he was being audited.
Yeah, no, yeah. yes, no, he didn't.
So tell us about the near verdict and the moment.
You want me to give it away?
Well, no.
I kind of feel like the near verdict. I kind of feel like people should read the book to get that moment.
Okay, so we're not going to.
Well, we can if you really want to.
I think you should tell.
All right.
You brought it up, so.
All right. So they inform the judge that they have a verdict, which made the Roosevelt team very nervous. They were hoping to get 4 jurors to hang. They thought if there's a verdict, it means we lose. And all of the newspaper coverage at the time indicated that as well. And they announced they have a verdict, and they start polling the jury. As you see in every case, is this your verdict? Is this your verdict? Is this your verdict? And they get to the 11th juror, and the juror says, "It is, as long as they split costs for the trial." Judge says, "Sorry, What do you mean if they split? He says, well, it's my verdict, but I have to know that the two sides are going to split the costs. The judge says, you can't put a caveat on your verdict. And the guy says, well, then then I don't have a verdict. I'm not ruling, I'm not ready to rule for Roosevelt. The jurors then have to go back and deliberate again, and they stay another night. And by the way, they were sequestered at a jail. So that they would the newspapers would describe it as the jurors were locked up again for the night at the local jail, and that's where they were sequestered, was at the jail.
So they browbeat this guy.
And then finally, and again, this would never happen today, but they're all sequestered at this jail, and the guy, the next morning, I guess it was, they'd had a full day of deliberations. The next morning, wakes up the four men, all men, to say, okay. And the foreman calls in a few of the other jurors, and they decide, okay, we've got a verdict. I mean, these days, any conversations without the entire jury being there, would create a mistrial. Back then they were sleeping at the jail, and someone wakes someone else up and says, I think I'm ready to side with you, and therein they had the verdict, and Roosevelt was so happy. He actually gave he said to the jurors, if any of you are ever in Oyster Bay, you've got the key. You've got the key to my house. He provided a signed copy of the trial. I think the transcript of the trial for each of the jurors. I actually tried to look up to see as a historical note. I thought it'd be fun to buy one of those if I could find it. I couldn't find it. So it was a big win for Roosevelt, and as I say, he updated his who's who profile once he won the trial.
That's a great side story. But also, you point out in the book, this was like the O.J. trial in terms of media attention. That were journalists packing this courtroom, and then the irony is at the very end, tragic irony, the Lusitania is sunk. And it sort of drives it a little bit off the front pages.
Well, no, it's actually during the trial. It actually becomes a very important point. So the Lusitania is sunk during the trial. And as you all know, there were 128 or so Americans who were killed when a German sub shot the missiles at the Lusitania. And 1,100 people were killed, 128 or so were Americans. And Roosevelt had to decide if he was going to make a statement about it, because 3 of the jurors were German Americans. And back then, a German American really meant you were closely affiliated with Germany. And the German American groups had spoken out against Roosevelt previously about comments he'd made about the U.S. getting into World War I, et cetera. And so his lawyers, the last thing they wanted was him commenting about now, again, about going after the Germans. And of course, Roosevelt, being Roosevelt, didn't listen to them and made a public statement about how serious this was, and again shows the need to get involved in the war. And his lawyers were very concerned that the 3 German Americans would take great offense to it.
It was probably cooked into their view since he'd been agitating for war in a way.
Yes.
So why didn't anybody? Was there the same kind of jury examination as there is now?
Well, no.
Because his lawyer could have said, "I object to this."
Right. Well, it's a statement he made outside of court.
No, I mean when they were selecting the jury.
Oh, when they were selecting the jury. So yes, the jury selection actually became the big questions became party affiliation mostly.
Interesting.
But they, and each side were using their peremptory challenges to try to, and the jury ended up being a mix of different parties on the jury. I think there were 3 Democrats, again defined as progressives, Republicans, et cetera, and so it was a political mix on the jury. But definitely backgrounds like that came into play in jury selection.
So Roosevelt emerges vindicated. Maybe he thinks triumphant, because you say he's busily changing his who's who and unbalancing it. But so how does the outcome affect what little future TR has? And then how does it affect Barnes, who, as you say, was aspiring to statewide office?
So I think that for both of them, the loser had much more to lose than the winner had to gain. And so if Roosevelt had lost, I think this would have been, it wouldn't have become a footnote to history. And I think because Barnes lost, his political career was effectively over. I mean, this was also being the plaintiff suing, bringing him to court, going through all the effort and the money and all, and then losing straight out. No hung jury, nothing. Was a big setback for Barnes. For Roosevelt, I think that it allowed him to kind of move on and move forward. And look, I think when Theodore Roosevelt died in 1919, I think that there was serious thought before that of running in 1920. In effect, his campaign was, I was right about the Germans, I was right about World War I, et cetera.
And he was right about the bosses.
Yes, and he was right about the bosses.
Corruption.
Yeah. So I think he viewed this case both in terms of his looking back, but also in terms of looking forward.
I think we have some time for questions, and we have a microphone, so please wait for it so our C-SPAN friends can hear. This man is going to,
Back in the booth.
from right. Can you get past? This will be audio only for our television viewers. Go ahead.
Hi, Dan. Dan, can you tell me a little bit about the two lawyers on the side and the judge? And then the other part of the question is, was there any attempt at jury tampering, either by the plaintiff or the defendants, to load the duck against one side or the other?
So there was no allegation of jury tampering that we know of. The judge did ask them, as a judge would in today's courtrooms every day, did you read anything about the case? Instructed them not to read newspaper coverage, et cetera, of the case. Each day they'd come in, he'd ask the same question each day to make sure that they had not been reading. Judge Andrews was really one of the most respected jurists at the time. You had, Ivins had actually, the plaintiff's lawyer, had actually worked on the Beecher-Tilton case of 1875, which was probably the highest profile civil lawsuit before this one. And of course, that was involving Henry Ward Beecher and allegations of an affair with a woman who was married to Tilton. But it was a very salacious, tawdry case, and Ivins had been involved in that. And Bowers was a big time attorney, the lawyer that Roosevelt had. So they both had prominent, I would describe them as corporate attorneys. They would be, the kinds of attorneys, these days, who both big law firm attorney types. They fared well with the judge. But there were a number of legal questions that came up during the trial that were close. And so the lawyering mattered. And who the judge was mattered. And they were critical questions. I mean, the single most important legal question that had to be resolved was the defense wanted to introduce evidence that Barnes was basically making money off of a side printing business that his newspaper had. They had a big printing press, et cetera, and that they were getting special deals from New York State, and they were effectively skimming, et cetera. And the question in the case became, is that the corruption Roosevelt was talking about? The plaintiff said, when he said corrupt, he wasn't talking about stealing money or printing business stuff. He was talking about this alliance between the Democrats and the Republicans. So why should that be admissible? And the judge allowed evidence to come in throughout the case while reserving judgment on the ultimate issue. And when Roosevelt's team lost and the judge said, I'm not going to allow any of it in, it felt like a huge loss to them. But in the end, it actually became sort of a victory because it meant that the plaintiff couldn't present evidence to rebut it. So the judge allowed it in to hear it, to determine whether it would ultimately be, and the jury heard it.
That's what I was going to ask.
Yeah, the jury heard it.
And then he said disregard it.
And then he said disregard it,
Right.
and not just disregard it, but disregard it, and they can't respond to it.
Yeah. Wow, that is
Yeah.
an interesting.
Yeah.
And is, by the way, I mean, newspapers printing party documents has been going on since 1800.
yeah,
so
yeah.
it's not. Yes, we have a question right here. Wait for the mic.
Was there ever an appeal from the verdict?
So both Barnes and his attorney claimed they were going to appeal. That was the first thing they said as soon as the verdict came in. Ivins became very ill at the end of the trial. And again, many believe that this trial and the hours and living away from home was the straw that broke the camel's back. And he died shortly after the trial. I think if Ivins had lived, I think that there might have been an appeal. I think Ivins might have insisted on an appeal to Barnes, but there was never an appeal.
Because it's not helpful to his reputation either.
Well, I mean,
suppose.
at some point,
He wanted to be the giant killer.
yeah.
Any others? Yes.
I'm glad you discovered this case. Great book. It's always been said that Chia's adventures, the safari adventures, really affected his health, took a major toll.
Yep.
This case, do you think this also added to the toll it might have taken
It's a good
with
question.
his premature death?
Yeah, it's a good question. Look, I think it was probably more the malaria and the bullet that he still had lodged in his chest from the 1911 shooting that probably were the bigger issues. I mean, as you mentioned, when he took a trip down, in addition to the safari, the trip down the Amazon is the one where he almost died. And that stuck with him for life. So, I think Roosevelt kind of enjoyed this trial. I think that he, look, did he like being sued? No. Did he want this lawsuit to go away? Yes. But once it happened, gave him a platform. He's out there able to speak about not just whether Barnes is corrupt with the head of the Democratic Party, but about his legacy. And I think that there was, I don't think this was that painful an experience. He went horseback riding on weekends. He was staying at a very wealthy friend's house, Horace Wilkinson. So, again, I don't want to say that he was loving every minute of it, but I think that this was not the sort of trauma for him throughout the trial.
Did you have a question? Ambassador Vanden Heuvel has a question. Wait for the mic, Bill. Bill, wait for the mic.
Franklin Roosevelt is often quoted as saying that he admired Theodore Roosevelt above all other men. Are there any anecdotes or any color that comes out of this trial where did they spend days together or just an hour or what?
No, it was they didn't, because again, Franklin had to come to Syracuse and had just recently gotten this new position as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he had to go back to work. And so he literally came up to testify in the trial. He knew many of the reporters there from his days as a New York legislator, because a lot of the reporters were New York-based or from New York State. But, we do describe the warm embrace, et cetera. And, one of the really interesting things, not just about Franklin Roosevelt, was almost all of the witnesses who testified, even if they weren't testifying for Roosevelt, would come up and shake his hand and, want to, sort of give him a back slap, et cetera, because he was Theodore Roosevelt. And so that's one of the, the sort of such interesting things about this. But there was no, we actually were hoping for more Franklin Roosevelt. As you can imagine, writing a book like this, we were trying to extract every Franklin Roosevelt we could. And I think we took it about as far as it went in the case. His testimony was pretty brief.
I think we have time for one more if there is one. We have to let our speaker go because he has a live television commitment, but you're all invited upstairs and we will toast him and make
Yeah,
him.
and I'm very
we will
sorry.
have such a great time. We're going
Yes,
to make him regret that he
and I want to
missed it.
apologize to everyone because I really wanted to be here, but this came up late last week that I have to host a show tonight in half an hour. So I'm running out, but thank you all for being here.
Thank
I really
you.
appreciate it. Thank you. Yes, I appreciate it. All right.